Today is January 16th, 2023. I want to talk about the conflict, the ongoing conflict in and around Ukraine. And I want to start out by talking about the fighting around Bakhmut and Soledar. Now, this is liveuamap.com. This is a pro-Ukrainian live map. And even this pro-Ukrainian map admits that Russian forces have consolidated control over most of Soledar and the surrounding areas. And you can see what they're doing. They are pushing toward these roads, these railways, and they are cutting Bakhmut itself off from potential reinforcements and resupplying. They're also swinging around the south toward the west. And they are also aiming at cutting off these roads and railways feeding into Bakhmut. And what will eventually happen, what happened in Soledar was an encirclement and the destruction of large numbers of Ukrainian forces, along with their equipment. Now a much wider encirclement of Bakhmut itself is underway. And Russian forces, this is consistent with the main objective of demilitarizing Ukraine. This is what you want to do. You don't want to drive Ukrainian forces out and simply take territory. You want to encircle and destroy their forces. That is the primary objective. And that is what Russian forces are going to achieve unless Kiev gives the order to evacuate Bakhmut. I was listening to updates by both Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikuris, both of the Duran. I will put their most recent videos, the links to their recent videos in the video description below. They were talking about the Western media and the West and Ukraine floating the idea of actually evacuating Bakhmut once and for all. Now, while that is all taking place, there were these significant missile strikes all across Ukraine carried out by Russian forces. Again, Alexander Mikuris, in his most recent update, talks about these strikes in depth. I just want to point out that in addition to grinding down Ukrainian forces and destroying or capturing large numbers of troops and also their equipment, they continue to hammer away at Ukraine's infrastructure, the power grid especially. And we kept hearing about Russia being on the verge of running out of missiles. And I'm going to talk about Russian military production here in just a moment. But then I saw this by the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Dmitry Kuleba. And this is a tweet. This is what he tweeted out. He says, each barrage of missiles further exhausts Russian stocks. However, they're still able to produce new ones. We can and must kill their missile and drone industry with a mass sanctions strike. I urge G7 and the EU to implement relevant sanctions proposed by Ukraine without delay. Well, good luck with those sanctions. The EU, they're on their 10th sanctions package. They can't even think of anything else to sanction. So what it seems like is they're giving up on this strategy of just waiting for Russia to run out of missiles. They know that will never happen. Now they are working their way through thinking about how they could possibly stop Russian missile production, which is, I would say, for them impossible. And I hope eventually they arrive at the only logical conclusion: stop giving Russia a reason to fire missiles at Ukraine. Stop serving as a belligerent proxy of NATO on Russia's border. Stop forming yourself into a national security threat to Russia right on its border, and then they will stop shooting missiles at you. I hope they arrive at that conclusion very quickly. Now, Ukrainian sources have said that Russia is making at least 40 cruise missiles per month. I have heard Russian sources claim that it's over 100. It may be somewhere in between, but whichever number it is, you could be sure that Russia is working on increasing it. It does not look like Russia is going to run out of missiles, and I don't think they're going to run out of anything else either. And again, I'm going to talk about Russian military production in just a moment. But I want to talk about what the West is doing to perpetuate or even escalate what is essentially a proxy war between NATO and Russia, using Ukraine trapped in the middle. And this is from the UK government. PM accelerates Ukraine's support ahead of anniversary of Putin's war. And it says the Prime Minister has announced the UK will send tanks and self-propelled guns to aid the Ukrainian offensive. Sending Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine is the start of a gear change in the UK's support. A squadron of 14 tanks will go into the country in the coming weeks after the Prime Minister told President Zelensky that the UK would provide additional support to aid Ukraine's land war. Around 30 AS-90s, which are large self-propelled guns operated by 5 gunners, are expected to follow. Now, what the UK government statement does not talk about are AH-64 Apache helicopters. These are attack helicopters that were supposedly going to be sent, just a handful of them. The UK government has come out and said, no, that is not going to happen, and it probably will never happen. And even if it does happen, it'll be even worse than this idea of sending Ukraine Western main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and all of this other equipment that they're not trained on, they're not familiar with, and they have no means of maintaining and sustaining on the battlefield. But let's talk about these AS-90s. I've talked about the Challenger 2s in a previous video. They use different ammunition than the rest of NATO's tanks. They have different engines, transmission, absolutely everything is different about them. So you're sending Leopard 2s, probably in larger and larger numbers over the next couple of weeks and months. And then you're going to send this handful of Challenger 2s, and you're going to have to create multiple supply chains to sustain all of these different types of vehicles. You're also going to have to create multiple pipelines to train Ukrainian troops on how to use them, and also multiple methods of maintaining them. And probably you're going to have to set up workshops in Poland to maintain each of these different vehicles that are being sent. There is no standardization at all. What about the AS-90? The AS-90 is like the M109. I've also talked about that. That is a 155 millimeter self-propelled howitzer. It's used by the United States and many other NATO countries, and they've sent large numbers of these M109s to Ukraine, and they have been being destroyed. They look like tanks, but they have much lighter armor relative to a main battle tank, which makes them vulnerable to a very wide spectrum of Russian weapons, including these Lancet loitering munitions, these kamikaze drones, and they have been destroying them very frequently. And we see videos of this up on Telegram, of these Lancet drones destroying these self-propelled howitzers. So the AS-90 is just going to be 30 more of these self-propelled howitzers on the battlefield. Again, totally different engine and transmission, different fire control, different everything. You're going to have to train Ukrainian troops, even if they're familiar with the M109, you're going to have to retrain them to use the AS-90. And they're still going to have all of the same problems the M109s are having, and the same problems Ukraine's own self-propelled howitzers had before Russia destroyed them all. They're outgunned. They're outgunned in terms of the number and variety of artillery Russia has, plus their military aviation and other long-range weapons that they have and can target Ukrainian artillery with, that Ukraine cannot answer back. So it's just a growing variety of weapon systems, adding additional complications to this hodgepodge of equipment that Ukraine is attempting to use on the battlefield. It's not even going to replace capabilities that Ukraine had at the beginning of this conflict. It's going to be increasingly cumbersome for Ukraine to use this equipment and sustain it on the battlefield. And more sources across the West, in the media, analysts, even officials are starting to come out and admit this reality. And I just wonder, it seems extremely desperate. NATO sending all of these different weapon systems, Ukraine having no real chance of using them effectively on the battlefield. There's only 117 AS-90s in the UK's inventory, so they're sending 30. That's 25% of their entire inventory. And they don't have that many Challenger 2 tanks. As a matter of fact, nations across Europe do not have each country does not have a large number of main battle tanks, and Germany, which makes the Leopard 2 the most likely candidate among Western main battle tanks that could possibly feasibly or most feasibly be sent to Ukraine in large numbers. Germany does not make all that many of them annually. So they're going to send an initial large number of them to Ukraine, and they will not be able to send another large number of them anytime in the near future. This is an article, a story actually, that many readers have pointed out to me. Readers and audience members have pointed this out to me. So this is from The Guardian. German battle tanks for Ukraine won't be ready until 2024. Now, Germany has a couple hundred Leopard 2s of their own that they could transfer to Ukraine. Remains to be seen, and this is what other countries are going to be doing. But Rheinmetall, which makes the smoothbore guns for a lot of NATO main battle tanks, they have a number of Leopard 2s, 22 to be exact, and another 88 older Leopard 1 tanks, which should be in museums, I think. And this is what they're talking about possibly sending Ukraine, but it will take almost an entire year to get them ready for battle and to transfer them over to Ukraine. So again, the same problem that Ukraine and their Western sponsors have been having this entire time. The West is not prepared for a large-scale industrial war like what is taking place in Ukraine right now. So Finland has some Leopard 2 tanks. I mean, there's a couple of countries in Europe that have these Leopard 2 tanks that could send them in large numbers initially, but then it's going to taper off because they don't have the ability to manufacture these in large numbers. Now, before I get into production numbers and Russian military production, I want to talk about the Apache helicopter. I know it's not being sent. It's very implausible, but I want to explain why it's so implausible so that you can understand the larger problem the West has with this concept of transferring Western heavy weapons to Ukraine. Because they've talked about sending other types of helicopters. They've talked about sending warplanes. What I'm about to explain to you about the Apache attack helicopter applies to all of these different weapon systems. So I'm reading from a Washington Post article from 1999 titled "Army's Apache Helicopter Rendered Impotent in Kosovo." And it says the Army spent $500 million sending 24, so 24, AH-64 Apache attack helicopters to Albania this spring for NATO's fight against Yugoslav troops tearing up Kosovo. But the Apaches never fired a shot in combat. Instead, they were grounded by Pentagon fears about potential U.S. casualties. The enemy had time to disperse into small groups before the Apaches arrived. The wooded mountain passes of Albania were shelter for scattered refugees and hundreds of Serbs with shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, which are now even more abundant on the modern battlefields, more abundant and more capable. And then this is talking about the training of the U.S. Army pilots operating these Apache attack helicopters. Although qualified to Army standards, none of the pilots was used to flying with night vision goggles. More than 65% were relatively inexperienced. At times, there was a complete loss of radio contact because of the high mountains, a confidential military after-action report states. And this is a problem that Western armies have. They have well-trained troops, but they're not prepared for certain types of missions. And if they don't take the time to do the proper training, they will not be able to carry out these missions effectively, despite having years of experience operating these weapon systems. That problem is compounded by the fact that Ukrainians don't have years of experience regarding the basic operation of all of these weapon systems, not just the Apache, but all of these weapon systems the West is transferring to Ukraine. And then the article talks about how the Apache attack helicopters were supposed to be used. And this goes back to my point that I've made many times, that all of these Western weapon systems are not designed to be used by themselves on the battlefield. They're meant to be used in combined arms warfare. And they all support each other. They have their own strengths and weaknesses. And when you use them in a combined manner effectively, they compensate for each other's weaknesses, and overall, this is how you win on a modern battlefield. So the plan, this is from the Washington Post, the plan was to zip through the Albanian mountains at 90 miles per hour. Bomblet-spewing ATACMS tactical missiles would have already pummeled the enemy troops along the flight path. Dart-filled rockets would deal with the remnants. 6 rescue helicopters would be 10 minutes away. 5 Apaches would fly a feint close by. A half dozen Air Force jets would provide protective cover. So they're talking about large numbers of helicopters flying different missions, long-range ballistic missiles, the ATACMS that Ukraine is asking the U.S. to send them, and also warplanes, Western warplanes, would be participating in this operation. So these are all things that Ukraine doesn't have, they're not going to have, and even if the U.S. and its allies, they transfer all of this equipment to Ukraine, they're not going to be able to use it effectively the way the U.S. Army imagined they would be using all of these weapon systems in Eastern Europe back in the 1990s. Now, the Washington Post also explains how the U.S. Army prepared for the use of the Apaches. Even though they didn't use them, they were preparing for their use. And I want to get across to you just how extensively you have to prepare for this type of weapon, to use this weapon on a modern battlefield, how extensive your preparations have to be to maximize your chance of success. And you will see that Ukraine has no ability to do what the U.S. Army did then, and this is why they are unable to use Western weapons effectively against Russia. So the Washington Post says it took just 4 days for the Army to remake the tiny Tirana airport into a 24-hour thoroughfare that could support 20 flights a day. This required 667,000 square meters of rock fill. Then they talk about problems setting it up because it was such an extensive construction project. And then it says to construct the base and make Task Force Hawk, this is what they were calling these 24 Apache helicopters, as invincible as possible, the Army brought in 10,300 pieces of equipment on 550 flights of the huge C-17. This is a strategic airlift plane that the U.S. uses to move military hardware around and also troops. The cargo included 14 70-ton M1A1 Abrams tanks, too heavy to use on most Albanian roads, 42 Bradley fighting vehicles, 25-ton Expando vans for the V Corps headquarters, 190 containers of ammunition, and enough repair kits for twice the number of Apaches there. 37 Black Hawk and Chinook helicopters went along too, because the rescue teams, they needed their own helicopters. You needed to be able to transport troops around in case maybe if the base came under threat, and you had these tanks and these Bradley fighting vehicles. All of this was to enhance the lethality of the Apache and to compensate for its weaknesses. It has many strengths, but it has many weaknesses. So the U.S. Army, to maximize the chance of success for their use, they sent in all of these other weapon systems as part of combined arms warfare. These are all things Ukraine will never be able to do. But this is what you need to do in order to carry out a successful military operation. These are things that Russia is capable of doing, Ukraine is not. And so all of these considerations with the Apache also go for main battle tanks and all of these other advanced weapons the West is trying to transfer to Ukraine. These are all things that Ukraine, toward the beginning of the special military operation, might have been able to do, but most certainly they cannot do now. And all while all of this pressure is being put on Ukraine by the Russian military on the battlefield, they continue chipping away at their infrastructure, the power grid, which complicates their ability to even attempt to do any of this. Now, I said I was going to talk about Russian military production. I want to talk about, so we see the West sending main battle tanks now, and they are beginning to send numbers of infantry fighting vehicles, 50 Bradleys from the US, 40 or 50 Marders from Germany. Again, two different vehicles, different engines, transmissions, ammunition, everything is different. They're going to have a different pipeline for training, maintenance, sustainment, everything. But they're sending these armored vehicles. Now they're talking about main battle tanks and self-propelled howitzers, 18 M109s, additional M109s from the US, 30 AS-90s from the UK. So they're trying to build armored brigades. That's what they're trying to do. At least one, maybe two, possibly three at most. And that depends on whether the rest of NATO starts sending likewise large numbers of their armored vehicles. How many tanks does Russia have right now, and how many are they able to put on the battlefield annually? That's what I wanted to explore. I looked at this article from CSIS. It's a U.S. government and Western arms manufacturer-funded think tank. This piece is titled, "Will the United States run out of javelins before Russia runs out of tanks?" And the short answer is yes. Yes, the U.S. will run out of javelins before Russia runs out of tanks. They more or less already have. This article was written months ago, but the point still stands. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the military balance, the Russians have 2,800 tanks and 13,000 other armored vehicles, reconnaissance and infantry fighting vehicles, in units with another 10,000 tanks and 8,500 armored vehicles in storage. So even the most ridiculous claims about what Ukraine has taken off the battlefield in terms of Russian tanks still means that Russia has a very large number of tanks on the battlefield. And it is a number of tanks that Russia still has on the battlefield that dwarfs any number of Western main battle tanks that can be transferred to Ukraine. What about Russian tank production year to year? So this is from Novaya Gazeta. This is a U.S. government-funded anti-Russian propaganda outlet, and their article is titled "The Barren Barrels. Russia's military industry has all sorts of problems. There are barely any details for tanks, aircraft, electronics, and newest missiles are in short supply." And obviously, we know that Russia has many missiles. They're obviously making large numbers of missiles, and so you can already see how this argument is falling apart. But let's see what they have to say about Russian tank production anyway. So they say, "Our source working for one of the state corporations in Russia estimates the current Uralvagen Zavod production capacity at 200 to 250 new tanks a year. The footage of Medvedev's visit indicates that the new tanks are being assembled manually and the old ones are being modernized on the stocks." And this kind of gives us a hint at how either ignorant or dishonest, or both, the people who wrote this article and the people who run the Novaya Gazeta actually are. All main battle tanks, Western or Russian or Chinese, they are all assembled manually. Some of the components require and utilize automated manufacturing, but once all of these parts come together, they are assembled manually on the factory floor. And this is footage from Medvedev's visit to the Russian tank factory. And then this is footage from a US factory making M1 Abrams. So you can see that they're all being assembled manually. So again, the article, just keep in mind, it is anti-Russian, and they're both, I think, both ignorant and also being dishonest on top of it all. And then the article says, Russia's tank industry is capable of producing up to 250 new vehicles, they just said that, and also modernizing up to 600 old ones each year. And that means they have T-72s, they have T-80s, and what they'll do is they'll modernize them. They will give them modern fire control systems, modern optics, so that they can see day or night under any type of weather condition. They can see the enemy before the enemy sees them, and they can kill them on the first shot. That is what modernizing a T-72 or a T-80 means. Plus, they're making brand new tanks like the T-90 Proriv. So that's 850 tanks, modern tanks, rolling onto the battlefield every single year. That is a very large number, and that is a much larger number than anything the West can send from their current existing stockpiles, and a much larger number than the West is capable of producing each year. The UK, for example, the UK government announcement said this is a gear change for UK assistance to Ukraine. They only have 200 Challenger 2 tanks. Okay, they only have 200 Challenger 2 tanks. They're already sending a quarter of their AS-90 self-propelled howitzers. They don't really have that much to send, even if they send absolutely everything. And the same goes for all of these other countries. Poland has about 250 Leopard 2 tanks. Finland has been talking about it. They have between 100 to 140 Leopard 2 tanks. And Germany, well, Rheinmetall, they say they have 22 Leopard 2 tanks sitting around that they could send Ukraine without taking main battle tanks from the German army itself. So you could see the problem that the West faces in terms of military industrial output. Russia prepared for this type of industrial warfare. The West is unprepared. Now I want to show you this article from Defense News. It's titled, Army Acquisition Chief Would Welcome Tank Ramp Up If Congress Funds It. And it gives us a little insight into Western main battle tank production. So it says, the Army plans to produce 22 tanks in 2023, which is 80 fewer than previously planned, 30 in 2024, 71 fewer than planned, and 53 in the year 2025, 60 fewer vehicles than planned. This equates to roughly a half a brigade combat team a year. And in the year 2026, the Army would build 42, followed by 40 in the year 2027. So they're talking about over 100 tanks a year. Elsewhere in the article, it talks about 15 tanks a month, which would work out to about 180 tanks a year. 180 tanks a year. And Germany, at full rate production of the Leopard 2 decades ago, I think it was about 300 Leopard 2 tanks a year. And they most certainly are incapable of doing that right now. It would take them years to get back to that type of production rate. But even if you took 300 and another 200, let's just round it up to 200 M1 Abrams from the US, if the M1 Abrams could feasibly be transferred over to Ukraine, that still falls far short of what Russia is doing right now. And I assure you that Russia is working on expanding their production rate as well. So the number of tanks on the battlefield right now, Russia vastly outnumbers Ukraine and whatever Western main battle tanks are sent. They produce more each year than the West can. So this reality where Russia outnumbers Ukrainian armor, no matter where they're getting it from, this is going to persist for years to come. This is industrial warfare. This is what a growing number of Western analysts are starting to talk about and admit. And now the Western media is also following suit. And this number of 850, I mean, this is, I think, a lowball number given by an obviously anti-Russian propaganda outlet. The number is likely much higher than that. I mean, it's the same article that said Russia was going to run out of cruise missiles, and they obviously haven't done that. They're obviously producing much larger numbers than the West thought they were, and I think the same probably goes for tanks. So these are all things to keep in mind as the West attempts to escalate this conflict. Is it desperation? Is this the West incrementally working their way up to just fighting Russian troops directly themselves? I don't know. I've talked about that possibility in the past. Other analysts, serious analysts, have talked about that in the past. This is something we'll have to keep an eye on, but keep an eye on all of this with this context in mind, Russia's military industrial capacity versus the West. So That's it for this video today. If you thought it was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. My YouTube videos are automatically uploaded to Rumble and Odyssey. Subtitles for my YouTube videos are automatically generated. All of this will show up in a day or two after this YouTube video is published. In the video description below are all of the links to everything that I've referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to block it or skip it. It's not doing me any good. If you do want to support my work, please do so by Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. The link to both of those will be in the video description below. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. That is what makes this work possible. Even if you're just sharing my content with others, that is also greatly appreciated. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.